Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for our 2 Steps Forward daily Bible study. We are up to episode 114, and that brings us to Exodus 23. So a couple chapters ago, we had the Israelites approaching Mount Sinai with a semblance of holiness and humility before God, recognizing His holiness. And in 20, we got the 10 Commandments. And in the subsequent chapters, we are getting essentially the parameters of the covenant that lay out how those 10 Commandments look in the day-to-day lives for the Israelites. Mm-hmm. Okay? So make sure to read through your copy of Exodus 23 at home, and here is my personal paraphrase. Again, we're looking at different laws of mercy and Sabbath regulations. We're going to look briefly at the 3 annual festivals of the Israelites. And then God is going to suggest how He's going to be sending His angel ahead of them to prepare the promised land for them.
Is that Jesus?
We shall see. That'll be part of the debate today. So, God warns against spreading lies, and these are in the laws of justice and mercy, picking up from 22. Going with the crowd because it's safe, going with the crowd because it's popular, or showing favoritism to anybody, either the rich or the poor. He says, in your societies, don't take anybody else's property like a donkey, or even if they are negligent with it, just because somebody else doesn't handle something the way that you think that they should, or the way that is right, doesn't entitle you to take it from them. Even if it belongs to your enemy, return their property to them. He also says, don't accept bribes or oppress the poor, and don't oppress foreigners. Again, things that people would have been inclined to feel entitled towards, perhaps. God says that the Israelites should work their land for 6 years, but then let it rest on the 7th. In other words, it's the same pattern as their weeks. You're supposed to work 6 days and then have a Sabbath day. Well, you also work the ground for 6 years. And interestingly enough, this is God's kind of economy, or His preservation of the earth. Mm-hmm. So the idea that people going green and the idea of caring for the world, God certainly has that concept built into His laws.
Someone just told me we only have 7 years left of the planet because our carbon footprint is so big.
Yeah, I
haven't heard that.
I'm not sure. I've crunched the numbers on that or that I'm qualified to, but yeah, I have not heard that. He says the same thing is true with animals and workers during the week. Work 6 days, make sure to rest on the Sabbath. So the concept of intentional work, intentional rest for humans, for animals, and for the earth are all programmed in here. God also, again, warns against the invoking of the names of other regional gods, the gods that are worshipped in the land that they're moving into. Then he talks about the annual festivals. And the 3 major ones are addressed here. 3 times a year, the Israelites were commanded to celebrate a week-long festival throughout the year. The first was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we also refer to as Passover. Mm-hmm. That would have been in what we call March. The second was the Feast of Harvest, or Weeks, or even in the Old Testament, it was referred to as Pentecost. We always think of that as a New Testament celebration, but remember, the Jews were in Jerusalem celebrating Pentecost when the Holy Spirit came down upon them. So that's in approximately May. And then there's the Feast of Ingathering, or Tabernacles, which is another kind of harvest festival, which is generally celebrated around September. They were based on, again, the agricultural year for the Israelites. Yes. The Israelites were supposed to bring the best, their first fruit offerings to God, and they were to make sure that they didn't mimic offering practices of the pagans. So strange sounding laws in here, like you're not supposed to cook a calf in its mother's milk. It's why can't they do that? Why shouldn't they do that? Were they in the custom of doing that? Generally, when you see something like that, there is a correlation to stuff that was done in the pagan practices, perhaps for a belief in fertility rites or something like that. So that you're not supposed to mimic what the pagans are doing. God then tells the Israelites to do everything He says and that they will be fine. His angel, and something He refers to as the Hornet, interestingly, will go ahead of them and defeat all the threatening enemies in Canaan. The Israelites are to completely destroy any worship places of the false pagan gods. And if they obey God's commands, the Israelites will live long, healthy lives. God says he will drive out the enemies, but not too quickly, because in doing so, that would leave the land desolate. The wild animals would become too large and too prevalent. And the Israelites needed time to grow as a people. So he's even taking all that kind of stuff into consideration. God says he will give the Israelites all of that Middle Eastern land if they don't fall victim to the foreign gods. And that's where Exodus 23 ends. Any initial thoughts there for you?
It would be interesting today if we had to receive the law again, for God to give us like more specific applications
To
for
today.
our time.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really curious what he would say about,
Don't watch these channels on TV.
yeah,
and
no
don't-
HBO.
Yeah.
No, I'm really curious what he would say about like in vitro fertilization or fertilization. I mean, in vitro is kind of an encompassing term, or like fertilization of embryos outside
Right.
of. Like, I would just be curious what he would say.
So, I mean, to make it a little bit broader of what you're that's a specific example. But obviously technology is the thing that
Right,
we
yeah.
think of as advancing most rapidly. Human nature is still the same, but the technology has advanced.
Curious what he would say about Facebook.
About Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Or
you
social
take,
media.
Right, you take things like internet usage, social media,
Just say this is not good for my
cell
people.
phones, as
a whole,
down to things like in vitro fertilization, and so you have something that is, I mean, people, let's just be real frank here, you have Christians on both sides of that discussion, and some are saying that is subduing the earth, and it is using technology in a way to facilitate life.
Yeah.
And that is part of the brilliance with which God created humans, that we can even leverage certain things like this and create life that way. And you have people on the other end of the spectrum that's saying, well, if you're fertilizing eggs, what does that mean about eggs that are fertilized but then destroyed? And so yes, the idea that if God was giving us the applications to laws today, he sends his Spirit so that we wrestle with these things in prayer and with other Christians that we respect. But how would he spell it out today would be interesting. It's I hadn't quite thought of it like that before, but yeah, when you read that current culture into what's going on here.
Because they're so
it's interesting.
specific. Like, if
Correct.
you'd be like, you are allowed to watch this many hours of TV a week,
Yeah, even
or screen time. God's
Yes.
telling you where.
I'm gonna spell it out. Yeah, what days during the week you work, what days you don't, how the worship practices are very specific. What you're allowed to do just because you're being part of your culture versus what you don't do because that particular cultural practice very clearly is a manifestation of idolatry. There's lots of things we have to navigate and think that through on our own, again by the guidance of our consciences and the Spirit, but it's never spelled out for us like it is here. Devotional thoughts for the day. Number 1, justice for the poor and the rich. Now, here's where, again, I think the Bible is brilliantly balanced, because repeatedly throughout the Bible, unquestionably, particularly I think in the Old Testament, you see God telling his people to show special attention and special favor to the marginalized of society. So the foreigners, the widows, the orphans, and the poor are the 4 groups that are often brought up. But essentially it's marginalized of society, the people in society that entering into relationship with them gives you no specific advantages, and so you got to pay special care. It requires grace to give special attention to them, and so he's saying, like, yeah, I want you to show grace and favor to them. However, when you get into the court system, some of the temptation, and we know this even today, like it's really easy to villainize the strong in society, or those who have power, those who have authority. And he very clearly here in verse 3, he says, do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. So if you look at, this is like, you think about all the negative talk about specifically like the 1% in society today, the idea that there's an enormous amount of wealth in the hands of a few amount of people.
Yeah.
Now, I think most people, including economists, would say that's maybe not the best thing for a society. And I think it's okay to agree with that. But to go through corrupt measures to say, okay, well, whenever they're in a lawsuit, somebody brings a lawsuit against them, even if it's unjust,
sure.
we're going to push it through because we don't want them to have so much money. Like God says, don't do that. That's not holy justice either.
Yeah.
So does God defend, the poor person in court? Absolutely. And again, that's an issue today as well. So we've talked about, money in America gives you opportunity to better legal representation, stuff like that. So yeah, don't oppress the poor in court, but don't unjustly treat the wealthy in court either. There should be a respectable, holy balance between the two.
I really like Bernie Sanders, and I like what he stands for. I don't think it necessarily would work the way he says it would, but aside from that, then I found out that he is super rich himself, and he has like multiple homes, and
Sure.
so then I thought it seemed a little, what's the word?
Hypocritical.
Hypocritical. So then I didn't like him quite as much.
Yeah, you might get a little bit of pushback from people on just the unilateral statement of I really like Bernie Sanders, but
yes, I think he's obviously extremely liberal, but I think if you had to lean towards caring for the marginalized people at your own expense,
he has a very consistent voice.
It's maybe better to lean that way.
Yes, he has a very consistent voice for the voiceless concept. We're crippling our young people with an indebtedness. We're crippling women and minorities of society by doing this, and this. And one of the things that I think you can say is it's societally healthy for somebody to constantly be pointing that out, because not everybody's thinking. We think in terms of majorities, every human does. And so having somebody call out, like, wait a second, you have to think this through from this person's angle too, I think is a really helpful kind of thing.
I like anyone who's saying something kind of radical because they truly believe in it and will continue to say it regardless of how much flack they take. But then I was like, what is he personally doing, though? He's just saying things.
Right.
And still owning multiple homes.
In which that, again, there's not inherently anything wrong by that either. It's but the question of to what degree does it become hypocritical? And so, for instance, if you're in the top, I think one of the things that you're suggesting is if you're in the top 8% of income, or by virtue of the fact that you live in America, you're in the top 2% in the world in income, and you villainize the top 1%. We over here, the other 99%, we are the good guys. You, because you meet this threshold, which is a little bit ahead of me, you're the bad guys. That's the type of talk that I think he sometimes presents that sets him up for being accused of criticisms of hypocrisy.
Yes. Additionally, I don't know that there's any need to put people against other people any more than they already are.
Correct. The whole conception of trying to seek unity, not
when you're fighting for the greater good.
Yeah. So it's I think I understand this is a kind of an inherently political type of topic, but when you talk about justice for the poor and justice for the rich, here's the thing is God is brilliantly seeking holiness for all while understanding the natural inclinations of fallen human hearts, that there might be some who try to gouge the rich and do it in sinful manners. And there are going to be some who try to oppress the poor and hold them down, obviously for sinful purposes and God is aware of all that. He builds it into his legislation in a way that I think is just so brilliant we're literally talking thousands and thousands of years ago, 3,500 years ago, that how nuanced his legislation is.
So my question is, they're how many years removed from Egypt at this point?
They're not years, they're months.
Oh, months. So how is anyone rich or poor? They all left with all the goods from Egypt. Did some people get more than others? Who's rich and why? Right.
So probably some had more than others.
Or is this
some households were bigger than others
in the future?
But he's setting them up to be a nation, and he's saying moving forward. So they haven't actually celebrated these festivals either that we're going to talk about. But he's still saying, here's how I want you to carry this out, because I can see your future, even though you haven't experienced it, and I know these are going to be problematic for you. So when these things happen, here's what you do to the wrongdoer in this way. Here's the proper way the holy way to execute it, the godly way. Second devotional thought is, in fact, those 3 annual festivals. The Israelites had more than 3 festivals, but there were 3 major festivals. And the festivals were, again, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or what's really confusing in this, they all have multiple names. So it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Passover is very closely connected to that. That's in the spring. The Festival of Weeks, or Pentecost, is early summer. And then the Festival of Booths, or Tabernacles, which the Israelites, so again, they haven't celebrated this yet. They're supposed to annually live out in temporary set up booths, tents. And that's supposed to constantly remind them for years that they lived once upon a time. They had to travel through the wilderness, and they were totally dependent on God every day. And so it was to connect them to their past deliverance like that. And the Jews were supposed to do that every year. The interesting thing, the only point I want to make about it here, because this is going to come up repeatedly, these festivals throughout the Old Testament, we'll have more time to talk about it elsewhere. The one connection that I want to make here, which to me is kind of fascinating, is the foreshadowing of the ministry of Christ. So, well, it's 3 pieces too. It's the foreshadowing of Christ, the foreshadowing of the church, and the foreshadowing of Christ's second coming. Because remember, Passover is the sacrificial lamb that the Israelites, under the blood of the unblemished lamb, the angel of death passed over their household, and the firstborn in the household was spared. Well, we are covered by the blood of the unblemished lamb. That very clearly is foreshadowing the ministry of Jesus Christ, to such an extent that when he institutes the Lord's Supper, and when he's crucified, he does it the night of Passover, right? So it's foreshadowing Jesus' ministry. Pentecost, again, New Testament believers always associate that with the anniversary of the Christian church, where Peter and the disciples get up in Acts 2 and they speak in tongues, and people from all nations hear it in their own language, and they go out and 3,000 are baptized, kind of thing. We forget that was a Jewish festival. You know, that was a specific Jewish festival, a certain period after Passover, and it foreshadows very clearly then obviously the ministry of the church, which is again an ingathering of souls in a sense. And then finally, the third major festival that you have here is the Festival of Booths, or Tabernacles, which is again a fall harvest festival where you're reaping what you're whatever the words are, reaping or gleaning, but you're bringing in the product from your fields. And that is the concept of what? Well, Christ is coming again, and he is going to take everything that the church has planted and produced that has come through the blood of Jesus Christ, the seeds of Christ. He is going to reap that and bring it back to heaven to be with him for all eternity. And so right here at the establishment of God's people, he sends them out into the wilderness. He says, you're going to become a nation, and here's 3 festivals I want you to celebrate every year. And they just so happen to, every single one of them foreshadows the most major events that are coming in the history of the Christian church. The coming and crucifixion, resurrection of Christ, the establishment of the Christian church, and the second coming and judgment of Jesus Christ. And they specifically fall to the day. And it's just it's kind of this mind-blowing, man, he knew this all in advance. Very clearly he's calculated every step of the way, right down to the calendar, you know? So anyways, that's the only connection I want to make for the annual festivals. The third devotional thought for the day is just, what is the hornet?
So my Bible doesn't even say the hornet.
What does it say?
The terror.
The terror. Well, yeah, terror is used there too. I think most translations would include hornet there.
What verse? 28?
It's a good question. Yes, 28. So chapter 23, verse 28, I will send the hornet ahead of you to drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way. And by the way, this is reiterated, almost the exact same language in Joshua 24, where after it's already happened, so this is years later, before Joshua is the leader of the Israelites after Moses, is going to lead them into the promised land, he says, here's what God did. He sent, one of the things that he did was he sent the hornet ahead to soften up the people of the ancient Near East in whose land will live.
Yeah, mine just says terror.
Yeah.
I will send terror ahead of you.
Yeah, so the question is, what exactly is this? Now, this is different from, what does he mean by terror then? I suppose you could interpret that as these nations will have heard what I've done.
What
for
is
you.
the Hebrew?
Yeah. So the Hebrew word for Egypt is a variation of it is used here, which is typically translated as hornet. So in other words, what seems to be happening, and it begins in verse 20 where God says, I'm going to send my angel ahead of you. And that most commentators, conservative commentators, will interpret the angel as the pre-incarnate Christ. Jesus is going ahead, and
What did he look like?
that is, don't know.
He took the form of a hornet.
No. So that's the thing is I don't think he is the hornet. And the hornet seems to be some metaphorical kind of language. But the hornet was a symbol. The image of a hornet was a symbol for Egypt because the two words are so closely linked together. And so what I think the hornet actually is, so I think Jesus actually is being sent, ahead of the Israelites to strengthen them, to encourage them, to increase their faith. He says he's going to send his terror ahead of them to throw the nations into confusion. That seems to be something different. The angel and the terror seems to be something different. But then after that, he says specifically he's going to send the hornet ahead of them. That's verse 28. I think what it is God sending the Egyptians, who were still a massive power at the time, and always looking to expand their borders and whatever. And we know that there were Egyptian forces historically that later on would enter into the ancient Near East and fight with some of these people, the Hivites and the other Canaanite people. And I think part of what that is God sending, by his divine providence, sending the Egyptians into the ancient Near East and weakening a lot of these forces so that when the Israelites go in, they're facing a lot of bruised armies. A lot of demoralized and just from a sheer number standpoint, defeated armies. And so in the grand scheme of things, is it miraculous? Yeah, it's all miraculous. Is it, Christ is there in this. I think the Spirit of God is there causing nations confusion and testifying to the greatness of the God of the Israelites who led them out of Egypt. And I think God is also using the geopolitical forces and navigating those of the Egyptians. I'm going to send them in, and they're going to take on these armies for 8 rounds so that when you Israelites come in, you're going to deliver the knockout blow because your opponent has been softened.
Does God still have any communication with Satan?
Yes. So
Jesus went down to hell.
Correct. To proclaim his victory over Satan
but he
to
didn't,
the people in hell.
He didn't bind him there or anything.
So when you get into the Revelation language, it talks about Satan as a chained dragon. And essentially what that means is, so God is the one who keeps him on a chain. And God is the one who allows Satan to, we just talked about this last night in worship with Paul's thorn in the flesh, where he talks about a messenger of Satan attached to his thorn in the flesh. And so it certainly appears that there's direct communication. Anything Satan is allowed to do to us, say to us, whatever, is only because God is allowing it. That would seem to suggest there's some communication going on there. So. All right. Anything else on Exodus 23?
I like that God has a pet dragon chained up in his basement.
It's
pretty neat.
Again, you have certain images that seem to be very helpful for you that I'm not sure they're helpful for everyone, even though that is the literal image that's used. To me, what I like is that, so God is he's encouraging the Israelites, he's helping out the Israelites, he's doing miraculous things, he's just come down on a mountain and shown lightning and thunder. So he manifests his miracles in what appear to be naturalistic ways, like fire and lightning and thunder and trumpet blasts and all that. But he also is arranging, when he uses non-believers, so he does this with Artaxerxes, he does this with King Darius and King Nebuchadnezzar at times. He uses non-believing authorities and he influences them to make certain decisions that end up helping out his people.
Like Pharaoh.
Pharaoh, he manipulates it sometimes. And then just the idea that anybody who gets worried about political stuff today, it's can bad stuff happen? Yes. Can stuff happen that is beyond God's control? No. And so if God is allowing it, he means very clearly he's intending some good to come.
You know, I also never thought about the fact that when Abraham got to heaven, Jesus wasn't there, right? I guess he was there, just not his body yet.
When Abraham got to heaven.
He was, he's still the pre-incarnate Christ.
He's pre-incarnate Christ, yeah.
Oh, so it is interesting that there were believers in heaven when Jesus came back after his resurrection.
Correct, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
The souls, who have already departed and been carried up to him. Yep.
That they got to experience that.
Christ post-resurrection. Yep. In the same way that those spirits in hell had enormous discouragement, the spirits in heaven would have been offered great joy and encouragement. So, all right, let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the beauty of your law. The immature way to look at your law is oppressive, and that it takes away fun and takes away freedom and takes away whatever. In reality, it's just like you designed us, and you just know how much better we work than we know. And so we can see some of the brilliance at times here, Lord. The justice for rich and poor so that people don't take advantage of one another. The premeditated festivals that foreshadow the entire Christian narrative. The fact that you rearrange political forces in such a way so that your people will prosper in the long run, even when we can't see it in the immediate. All of it is just such evidence of your grace, and one day in heaven, when our eyes actually are open, we're going to be able to see all the grandeur and spectacle of all of it. And we're looking forward to that, Lord. But in the meantime, through eyes of faith, we simply just appreciate it. And it's great to see it in our history with your people here too. Help us to continue to have our eyes open and see some of this stuff in the days to come. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks again for studying with us. We'll see you tomorrow for Exodus 24.